The laughter stopped the moment the child spoke. 23 men in tailored suits had gathered in the private room on the second floor of the Obsidian Club, glasses of whiskey in hand, cigars trailing smoke toward the vaulted ceiling. They had come to watch a woman beg. That was the entertainment for the evening. That was what Vance Duthie had promised them when he'd sent his wife in his place to answer for his debts. But nobody was laughing now, because the woman's younger daughter, a 5-year-old with tangled hair and a jacket 2 sizes too big, had looked up at the circle of powerful men and asked a question that landed like a grenade in the center of the room. "Mommy, are these the men who are going to take us away? Is that why Daddy said you have to get on your knees?" The mother's face went white. And then the second question came, quieter, from the older girl standing beside her. "If they hurt you, will anyone help us this time? Or will everyone just watch again?" At the back of the room, a man who had built an empire on silence and control set down his glass, because Stellan Varys had heard those words before, 57 years ago, from his own mouth. The Obsidian Club existed in the margins of the city, in the space between what was legal and what was tolerated. It sat 3 blocks east of the financial district, behind an unmarked door at the end of Verlaine Street, in a building that had once been a textile warehouse and was now something else entirely. The second-floor room where the men had gathered was paneled in dark walnut. The lighting was deliberately low, amber bulbs in iron fixtures casting long shadows across the Persian rug. A mahogany bar stretched along the western wall, attended by a man who had learned decades ago never to remember faces. The chairs were leather, deep burgundy, arranged in a loose semicircle facing the entrance. It was a room designed for transactions, for negotiations, for the kind of conversations that left no record. Tonight, it had been designed for humiliation. Word had spread through certain circles that Vance Duthie owed significant money to significant people, that he had borrowed against promises he couldn't keep, that he had been given 3 chances to make it right, and had squandered each one with excuses and delays. So the men had gathered, not because they needed the money, most of them could lose Vance's debt in a weekend and not notice, but because debts were about more than currency. They were about order, about respect, about demonstrating what happened when someone failed to honor their word. Vance had been summoned to answer for himself. Instead, he had sent his wife. She stood now just inside the doorway, one daughter clinging to each hand, wearing a dress that had been mended twice at the hem. Her eyes moved across the room with the quick, fractured calculation of a woman who had learned to assess threat the way others assess weather. The men had expected her to cry, to stammer, to kneel and plead. They had not expected her to bring children. They had not expected those children to speak. And they certainly had not expected what happened next. Celine Duthie had not always been a woman who flinched at shadows. There had been a time, it felt like another lifetime now, when she laughed without checking the room first, when she spoke without measuring each word against the probability of punishment, when she walked through the world like someone who belonged in it. She was 32 years old. Her hair was the color of dark honey, though it hadn't been washed in 4 days. Her eyes were a pale gray green that people used to comment on at parties. Back when she went to parties, back when Vance allowed her to go anywhere at all. Now those eyes held something else, a quality of permanent vigilance, the look of an animal that has learned the hard way that stillness is not the same as safety. She had met Vance Duthie 9 years ago at an art exhibition in the city. He had been charming then, attentive, the kind of man who noticed when your glass was empty before you did, the kind who remembered small things, your favorite flower, your mother's birthday, the name of your childhood dog, and deployed them at moments designed to make you feel seen. She hadn't understood then that noticing was also a form of surveillance, that the same attention that made her feel cherished would eventually be used to catalog her weaknesses, to map her vulnerabilities, to construct a cage so precisely fitted to her dimensions that by the time she recognized it as a cage, She no longer remembered how to live outside of it. The first time he hit her was 11 months into the marriage. She was pregnant with Bryony. She had laughed too loudly at something his colleague said at a dinner party, and on the drive home, Vance had pulled into an empty parking lot and backhanded her so hard her vision sparked white. He had apologized afterward, cried even, blamed the stress of his work, the pressure of his investments, and the fear of becoming a father. She had believed him because she needed to believe him, because the alternative was admitting she had built her life on a fault line. She had believed him for years. The hitting became routine, not constant. That was part of its power. It came without pattern, without warning, like weather in a country with no seasons. A week might pass, sometimes two, and Celine would begin to breathe again, begin to think perhaps it had stopped, perhaps he had changed. And then a glass would shatter against the wall beside her head. A door would slam so hard the frame cracked. Fingers would close around her throat in the kitchen while the children were watching television in the next room. Bryony was 7 now. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's watchful eyes. She rarely spoke when Vance was home. She had learned, somewhere in the wordless curriculum of a violent household, that silence was armor. Tansy was 5. She still laughed easily, still believed in magic, and still thought her father was simply tired when his voice turned sharp. But lately, even Tansy had begun to change. She had started carrying a stuffed rabbit everywhere, a worn gray thing named Button, and when arguments began, she would press the rabbit over her ears and hum. Celine had started planning to leave 2 years ago. Small preparations. A bag hidden in the back of her closet with copies of documents, a change of clothes for each girl, a prepaid phone she had bought with cash at a convenience store 40 miles from their home, a fold of emergency money, bills she had saved 1 and 2 at a time from grocery change, from returning bottles, from the quarters Vance left on his dresser. She had saved $412. It had taken her 23 months. Then Vance found the bag. She still didn't know how. Maybe he had been looking for something else. Maybe one of his surveillance habits. Checking her phone, reading her emails, timing how long it took her to run errands, had finally led him to her closet. He hadn't hit her that night. That was almost worse. He had simply held up the bag and smiled and said, "You think you're clever, don't you?" And then he had taken everything. The money, the documents, the prepaid phone. He had burned the phone in the kitchen sink while she watched. He had put the money in his wallet and told her it would go toward what she owed him. That was 3 months ago. Since then, the cage had tightened. He tracked her location through her phone. He timed her errands to the minute. He moved the car keys to a different hiding place each night so she couldn't leave without asking permission. And somewhere in those 3 months, Vance's business had collapsed. She didn't know the details. He never told her details. But she knew enough. The late-night phone calls that made him throw things, the men who came to the house at odd hours, men who looked at her like she was furniture, the way Vance had started drinking at noon, then 11, then 10. He owed money, a lot of money, to people who did not negotiate. And tonight, those people had summoned him. Vance had received the call at 6 o'clock. Celine had watched his face change as he listened, the arrogance draining out, replaced by something she had never seen before. Fear. He had hung up and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're going," he said. "Going where?" "To the Obsidian Club, Verlaine Street. You're going to tell them I'll have the money by Friday. You're going to be convincing." "Vance, I don't even know these people. I don't know anything about your—" "That's the point." His voice was flat. "They won't hurt you. You're a woman. You have the girls. They'll feel sorry for you. They'll give me more time." He was sending her as a shield, as a sympathy prop, as a human sacrifice to buy himself another week. "And if they don't feel sorry for me?" she whispered. Vance's expression didn't change. "Then I guess you'd better be more convincing." She had taken the girls because she had no choice. There was no one to leave them with. No neighbors, no friends, no family. Vance had made sure of that years ago. The architecture of his control was complete. She was alone. And so, at 7:30 on a Thursday evening in October, Celine Duthie had walked through an unmarked door on Verlaine Street, holding her daughter's hands, and stepped into a room full of men who had gathered to watch her beg. She had not expected to beg. She had not expected anything at all. And she certainly had not expected the man at the back of the room to recognize something in her daughter's questions that would change everything. The silence in the room had a texture. It pressed against the walls, filled the space between the men, settled into the leather chairs like something physical. Celine could feel 23 sets of eyes on her daughters, on the place where Tansy's sleeve had slipped down to reveal a wrist so thin it looked like it might snap. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The girls had eaten. She had made sure of that, portioning out the last of the bread and peanut butter that morning, telling them she'd already had breakfast, smiling while her stomach cramped. But Celine herself had consumed nothing but water and half a cup of coffee that had gone cold before she could finish it. Her dress, the navy one with the mended hem, hung looser than it had 6 months ago. Her collarbone stood out like a ridgeline. Her wedding ring, which had once fit snugly, now slid freely up and down her finger. She kept pressing it back into place. A nervous habit. A reminder of the cage she still wore. Bryony stood to her left, perfectly still. The child had learned stillness the way other children learn to ride bicycles. Through repetition, through consequence, through the slow understanding that movement attracted attention, and attention attracted pain. Her eyes moved across the room the same way her mother's did, scanning, calculating, mapping the exits. There were 2. The door they had come through, now behind them, and a service entrance near the bar, half hidden behind a velvet curtain. Bryony had already identified both. She was 7 years old, and she knew how to plan an escape route. Tansy stood to Celine's right, still holding Button the rabbit against her chest. She had asked her question, the one about getting on her knees, without understanding what it meant. She had heard Vance say it. She had repeated it the way children repeat things, without context, without malice, with the terrible clarity of innocence. And now 23 men were staring at her. One of them, a thick-necked man in a charcoal suit, someone Celine vaguely recognized from the visits to their house, let out a low laugh. "Vance sent his wife," he said, "and his children, to answer for his debt." Another man shook his head. "That's a new low, even for him." "It's smart," said a third, younger than the others, with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He knows we won't touch her. He's buying time." "Are we sure we won't touch her?" The thick-necked man again. His gaze moved over Celine slowly, deliberately, with the kind of assessment that made her skin crawl. "She's not bad-looking. Bit thin. But not bad." Celine's grip on her daughter's hands tightened. "Mommy," Tansy whispered. "That man is looking at you funny." "I know, baby. Don't look at him." "But why is he—" "Don't look at him." The young man with the slicked hair stood up. He walked toward Celine with a casual stride, hands in his pockets, as if approaching a painting in a gallery. He stopped 3 feet away and tilted his head. "So," he said, "what exactly did your husband tell you to do here tonight?" Celine's voice came out steadier than she felt. "He said to ask for more time, until Friday." "Friday?" The man smiled. "That's 5 days. What happens Friday?" "He said he'd have the money." "He said that last month, too. And the month before that." The man reached out and touched a strand of Celine's hair, letting it slide between his fingers. "I wonder," he said softly. What Vance would give us if we decided to keep you instead. At the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor, and a voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. Cade, sit down. Stellan Varys did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. He was 63 years old, with steel-gray hair cropped close to his skull and eyes the color of winter slate. His face had the weathered quality of a man who had spent decades navigating terrain that broke other people. The lines around his mouth were not from smiling. They were from decisions, from calculations, from the particular kind of discipline required to build something permanent in a world that preferred chaos. He ran an organization that operated across 4 states. He employed over 300 people, most of whom had never met him, all of whom knew his name. He had lawyers, accountants, politicians, and police, not in his pocket, because that implied a transaction that could be undone, but in his architecture, built into the structure of his enterprise so deeply that removing them would collapse things no one wanted collapsed. He was not a man who attended events like this. The settling of minor debts, the intimidation of small-time borrowers, these were beneath his attention, handled by lieutenants and enforcers and the machinery of consequence he had built over 4 decades. But tonight, Stellan had come. He had come because something had been nagging at him for weeks. A restlessness, a feeling he couldn't name, like a splinter beneath the skin that refused to surface. He had told himself it was business, that he needed to see his operation in action. That distance bred softness, and softness bred failure. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that Stellan Varys had been having dreams. The same dream, repeating. A kitchen with yellow wallpaper. A woman standing at the sink with her back to him. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway. And then his own voice, small and high and terrified, asking, "Mama, is he going to hurt you again tonight? Should I hide?" He hadn't dreamed of his mother in 20 years. Her name had been Lenora. She had worked as a seamstress in Cardwell, Georgia, taking in alterations for a dry cleaner 6 days a week, coming home with her fingers raw and her back bent, and a smile for her son that never quite reached her eyes. She had been beautiful once, before the bruises became regular, before the light in her face dimmed to something barely flickering. Stellan's father had been a man named Howell Varys, and he had been a monster. Not the kind of monster that announced itself. Howell had been charming in public, generous with neighbors, quick with a joke at the barbershop. He coached Little League and organized church fundraisers and shook hands with a grip that made men respect him. Behind closed doors, he was something else. Stellan had learned to read the signs by the time he was 5. The way Howell's shoulders tightened when dinner was late. The way his voice dropped half an octave when he'd been drinking. The way silence in the house wasn't peace but pressure, building and building until it found its release in the sound of his mother's body hitting the wall. She never screamed. That was the thing Stellan remembered most. Lenora Varys took her beatings in silence, as if screaming would give her husband something he wanted, as if her quiet was the last territory she controlled. She had died when Stellan was 14, not from the beatings directly. From pneumonia, the doctor said, from a body too exhausted to fight infection. But Stellan knew the truth. The pneumonia had simply finished what his father had started years before. He had stood beside her hospital bed and held her hand while the machines beeped their slow descent into silence. He had promised her, not out loud, but in the deep place where promises that matter are made, that he would never be powerless again, that he would build something so strong that no one could hurt him, that he would never look away when he saw what his father had been. He had kept the first 2 promises. The third one had been harder. Because looking away was easy. Looking away was comfortable. Looking away was what everyone did, and Stellan had spent 49 years telling himself that other people's pain was not his concern. And then a 5-year-old girl with tangled hair had asked her mother if she had to get on her knees. And everything Stellan had built to protect himself cracked right down the center. The man called Cade froze with his hand still near Celine's hair. He turned slowly, the arrogance draining from his face, replaced by something Celine didn't immediately recognize. It took her a moment to understand. Fear. Mr. Varys, Cade said, I know what you were doing. Stellan's voice remained level, almost soft. Sit down. Cade sat. The room rearranged itself in subtle ways. Men who had been lounging straightened. Glasses were set down. Cigars were lowered. It was as if a current had passed through the space, aligning everyone toward the man now walking forward from the back of the room. Stellan moved without hurry. His shoes made no sound on the Persian rug. He stopped 10 feet from Soline and her daughters, close enough to see the tremor in the woman's hands, the way the older girl had shifted her weight onto the balls of her feet, ready to run. He looked at Bryony first. The child looked back. There was no fear in her eyes. That was what struck him. There should have been fear. She was 7 years old, standing in a room full of men who had been discussing her mother like merchandise. But instead there was something else. A flatness. A calculation. The look of someone who had already accepted that the world was dangerous and had moved past fear into something colder. Stellan recognized that look. He had worn it himself, standing in the doorway of a kitchen in Cardwell, Georgia, watching his mother hold a frozen bag of peas against her own face. Then he looked at the younger girl, Tansy. She was clutching a stuffed rabbit so tightly its seams strained. Her eyes were wide, but not with fear either. With confusion. She didn't understand why these men were looking at her mother like that. She didn't understand what "get on your knees" meant. She had simply repeated what she'd heard, the way children do. And now she was watching the adults to figure out if she had done something wrong. Stellan's chest tightened. Finally, he looked at Celine. She met his gaze directly. That surprised him. Most people looked away from Stellan Varys. Most people found something suddenly fascinating about the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but his eyes. But this woman, this thin, trembling woman in a mended dress, looked right at him. And in her eyes he saw everything: the exhaustion, the vigilance, the particular quality of brokenness that comes not from a single wound, but from 1,000 small cuts delivered over years. He saw a woman who had stopped hoping for rescue and was simply trying to survive the next hour. He saw his mother. Stellan turned to the room. Everyone out. No one moved. Now. 23 men rose and filed toward the door without a word. Cade paused at the threshold, glancing back, but something in Stellan's expression made him think better of whatever he'd been about to say. The door closed, and Celine was alone with her daughters and the most powerful man in the room. The silence after the door closed was different from the silence before. Before, it had been predatory. The silence of men circling. Now it was something else. Expectant. Uncertain. The silence of a room that had suddenly changed its purpose. Celine kept her daughters close. Her eyes tracked Stellan as he moved to the bar, poured a glass of water, not whiskey, water, and set it on a table near her. "For you," he said. "You look like you haven't had anything in a while." She didn't move. "It's not a trick." His voice was quiet. "It's water. If you don't want it, that's fine. But your hands are shaking and your lips are dry, and I'd guess you've been running on empty for longer than today." Celine stared at the glass. Her throat ached. Her body screamed for her to reach for it. But 9 years with Vance had taught her that gifts were never free. That kindness was currency. That every offering came with an invoice that would arrive later, when you were least prepared to pay. "What do you want?" she asked. "Right now? I want to understand what's happening here." "My husband owes you money. He sent me to ask for more time. That's what's happening." Stellan shook his head slowly. That's not what I'm asking about. He looked at Bryony, who was still watching him with those flat, calculating eyes, then at Tansy, who had buried her face in Button the Rabbit and was humming softly. A self-soothing behavior Celine recognized too well. Your daughter, Stellan said, asked if you would have to get on your knees. She asked if anyone would help when you got hurt, or if everyone would just watch again. Celine's face tightened. Children say things. They don't understand what they're... She understood exactly what she was saying. Stellan's voice was not unkind, but it was certain. She's heard those words before. She's seen things that taught her those words. And the older one? Bryony, is it? Celine flinched at the name. She hadn't told him their names. He'd been listening, observing, cataloging. Bryony, Stellan continued, hasn't taken her eyes off the exit since she walked in. She's standing on the balls of her feet. She's positioned herself between her sister and the rest of the room. She's 7 years old and she's running tactical assessments. She's just cautious. She's a child who's learned to survive in a war zone. The words hit Celine like a slap. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. I know what that looks like, Stellan said quietly, because I was that child. Celine's breath caught. Stellan pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat down, deliberately lowering himself, making himself smaller, less threatening. It was a calculated gesture, and Celine recognized it as such, but it worked anyway. Some of the tension in her shoulders released. I'm not going to hurt you, he said. I'm not going to hurt your daughters. And whatever your husband owes, that's between him and the people he borrowed from. You're not collateral. You're not a bargaining chip. You're a woman standing in a room where you shouldn't have to be, holding the hands of 2 children who have already seen too much. Tansy lifted her head from the rabbit. Mommy, is this man nice? Celine didn't answer. She didn't know. Bryony spoke instead. He made the other men leave. That doesn't mean he's nice, Celine said carefully. Sometimes people make other people leave so they can... So they can what? Stellan asked. Celine met his eyes. So they can do worse things without witnesses. Something flickered across Stellan's face. Pain, maybe. Or recognition. That's a fair concern. You've learned to think that way for a reason. He paused. But I'm not your husband. I don't know what you are. No, you don't. And you have no reason to trust me. He leaned forward slightly. But I'm going to tell you something. And then I'm going to make you an offer. And you can decide for yourself whether to accept it. What's the something? Stellan's jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice had changed. Rougher. Older. As if the words were being pulled from somewhere deep. When I was 6 years old, I asked my mother the same question your daughter just asked. Whether anyone would help. Whether everyone would just watch. He paused. Everyone watched. No one helped. My mother died when I was 14, and I spent the rest of my life making sure I would never be that helpless again. Celine felt something shift in her chest, a door she had locked years ago, rattling on its hinges. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I'm telling you because I need you to understand why I'm about to do what I'm about to do. He stood. You're not going back to your husband tonight. Neither are your daughters. I'm going to make sure of that. You can't just... I can. His voice was quiet but absolute. The question is whether you'll let me. Celine should have said no. Every instinct she had developed over 9 years screamed at her to refuse, to take her daughters and walk out the door and take her chances on the street. Strangers offering help were never just offering help. There was always a price. There was always a hook buried in the bait. But Bryony was looking at her. Bryony, who never asked for anything, who had learned before her 6th birthday that asking meant disappointment, and disappointment meant pain. Bryony, who planned escape routes and slept with her shoes on, and flinched at raised voices. Bryony was looking at her mother with something Celine hadn't seen in years. Hope. Okay. Celine heard herself say. Okay. Stellan nodded once. He pulled out his phone and sent a single text. 30 seconds later, a side door opened and a man appeared. Tall, dark-skinned, with a shaved head and the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years anticipating needs before they were spoken. Corvin, Stellan said, I need the back room prepared. Food, water, blankets, and get Cressida Halloran on the phone. Corvin didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and disappeared. Stellan led them through the side door, down a corridor lined with framed photographs of the city in older decades, and into a room that was smaller than the one they'd left, but infinitely warmer. A fireplace crackled against one wall. A leather sofa sat facing it, flanked by 2 armchairs. A small table held a carafe of water and glasses. Tansy looked around with wide eyes. Is this a living room? It's a private room, Stellan said, for conversations that need quiet. It's warm, Tansy said. She said it like warmth was a miracle, like she had forgotten what it felt like. Celine's heart cracked a little more. They sat on the sofa, the 3 of them. Stellan took one of the armchairs, maintaining distance, maintaining the careful geometry of someone who understood that proximity could feel like threat. Corvin returned with a tray. Sandwiches, fruit, cheese, crackers. Simple food, but Tansy's eyes went round at the sight of it. Can I eat one? She whispered to Celine. You can eat as many as you want, Stellan said before Celine could answer. Tansy looked at her mother for confirmation. Celine nodded, and Tansy reached for a sandwich with both hands, forgetting Button entirely, eating with the desperate focus of a child who had learned that food was not guaranteed. Bryony didn't eat. She watched. Celine took a small piece of cheese, more to show the girls it was safe than because she had any appetite. Her stomach was a knot. Her mind was racing, trying to calculate the angles, trying to figure out what this man wanted, what the cost of this kindness would be. You're waiting for the trap, Stellan said. Celine looked at him. You're sitting there eating cheese you don't want, watching me for signs that this is going to turn into something else. He paused. I understand that. But I need you to tell me what you're running from. Not your husband's debt. That's his problem. I need to know what happened to you. What made your daughter ask those questions? Why? Because I can't help you if I don't know what I'm helping you escape. The word hit her. Escape. He had said it so simply, as if it were possible. As if there were an exit from the maze Vance had built around her life. You don't know what you're offering, she said quietly. Then tell me. And something broke loose. Maybe it was the warmth of the room. Maybe it was the sight of Tansy eating without fear. Maybe it was the look in Bryony's eyes, that fragile hope that Celine couldn't bear to extinguish. Or maybe she was simply tired. Tired in the way that goes past exhaustion into something deeper. The kind of tired that makes you willing to risk everything because carrying the weight alone has become impossible. She started talking. She told him about Vance, about the charm and the courtship and the slow unveiling of the monster beneath. About the first slap, 11 months in. About the escalation, the punches, the choking. The night he threw her down the stairs and she told the emergency room she had fallen. She told him about the isolation, how Vance had systematically removed every person from her life. Her college roommate who had called too often. Her sister who had asked too many questions. Her neighbor who had noticed a bruise and made the mistake of mentioning it. One by one, Vance had engineered conflicts, manufactured reasons for distance, until Celine stood alone on an island of his construction with no bridge back to the world. She told him about the control, the tracking, the timing, the way Vance monitored her phone, her email, her location. The way he rationed money so she could never accumulate enough to leave. The way he moved the car keys, hid her identification, kept her passport in a safe she didn't have the combination to. She told him about the night she had tried to leave, 2 years ago. How she had packed a bag and gotten as far as the bus station before Vance found her. How he hadn't hit her that time. Just smiled and said, "You're not very good at this, are you?" And driven her home in silence. How the next morning he had installed new locks on all the doors, locks that required a key to open from the inside. She told him about the bag she had hidden 3 months ago, the one with the documents and the emergency phone, and the $400 she had saved 1/4 at a time. How Vance had found it. How he had burned the phone while she watched. How he had told her she would never leave, that she was his, that the only way she would ever be free of him was in a box. She told him about tonight, how Vance had received the call about his debt, and his face had gone pale. How he had told her to go to the Obsidian Club and beg for more time. How he had said to bring the girls because they won't hurt a woman with children. "He sent us as shields," she said. Her voice was flat, empty. "He sent us to buy himself a week. He didn't care what happened to us. He just needed time." She stopped. Her hands were shaking. Tansy had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted from the food and the warmth. Bryony was still awake, still watching, but her eyes had changed. The flatness had softened into something else. Something that looked almost like relief. Stellan sat in silence for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough. "Your husband," he said, "is not going to touch you again. You don't know him. He'll find us. He won't find you. And if he does, he'll wish he hadn't." Celine shook her head. "You don't understand. He has connections. He has lawyers. He filed a report once when I tried to take the girls to my sister's house. Said I was kidnapping them, that I was unstable. The police believed him. They always believe him. He's charming, and I'm—" "You're what?" She looked at her hands. "Broken." The word hung in the air. Stellan leaned forward. "You're not broken. You're surviving. There's a difference." He paused. "And his connections, his lawyers, his charm, none of that matters in my world. In my world, I decide who has power. And I've decided that he doesn't. Not anymore." Stellan made 3 phone calls. The first was to Corvin. "The property on Greystone, open it tonight. Stock the kitchen. Make sure the security system is active and the codes are changed. No one enters without my direct authorization." The second was to a woman named Cressida Halloran. Celine listened as Stellan spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. "I have a client for you. Woman, 2 children. Domestic situation. The husband has resources and connections, but nothing we can't handle. I need an emergency protective order filed by tomorrow morning. I need documentation of abuse, hospital records, photographs, anything we can pull. And I need you to be prepared for a custody battle, because he's going to claim she kidnapped the children." He listened for a moment, then said, "Money's not a factor. Whatever it takes. Call me when you have something." He hung up and looked at Celine. "Cressida Halloran is the best family attorney in the state. She handles cases like yours. She has never lost a custody dispute. I can't afford—" "You're not paying. I am." "Why?" Stellan's jaw tightened. He looked at Tansy, still sleeping against Celine's shoulder, and at Bryony, who had finally allowed her eyes to close, her head resting against her mother's arm. "When I was 6 years old, my mother sat in a kitchen with a black eye and told me we were fine. And I believed her, because I was 6 years old and I didn't know what else to believe. And every day after that, I watched her get smaller, quieter, more afraid, until one day she was gone." He paused. No one helped her. No one stopped what was happening. And I spent my entire life building power, building control, building an empire, telling myself it was so I would never be helpless again. But the truth is, I was running from that kitchen, running from that boy who couldn't protect his mother. His voice roughened. I can't go back and save her, but I can stop running. I can look at what's in front of me and not look away. The third call was shorter. Stellan dialed a number, waited 2 rings, and said, Vance Duthie. Find out everything. Debts, assets, legal exposure, criminal history, and make sure he understands that his wife and children are no longer his concern. He hung up. What does that mean? Celine asked. What are you going to do to him? Nothing illegal. Stellan's expression was unreadable. But your husband lives in a world of appearances. He survives because people believe his version of things. By the time I'm finished, no one will believe him. His creditors will call in their debts. His lawyers will stop returning his calls. His friends will suddenly have other commitments. He paused. I'm not going to hurt him, Celine. I'm going to make him irrelevant. Celine felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she had carried for so long she had forgotten it was there. Why do you keep calling me Mrs. Duthie? Because I don't know what else to call you. Celine, she said. My name is Celine. Stellan nodded. Celine. There's a house waiting for you. It's safe. It's warm. It has locks on the doors that only you will have the keys to. You're going to sleep there tonight, and tomorrow Cressida is going to call you, and we're going to start building a wall between you and the man who hurt you. And if the wall doesn't hold? Stellan's eyes met hers. I've been building walls for 49 years. They hold. The house on Greystone Lane sat at the end of a quiet street lined with oak trees whose branches arched overhead like a cathedral ceiling. It was modest by the standards of the neighborhood. 2 stories, red brick, white trim. But to Celine, walking through the front door at 11 o'clock at night with a sleeping child in her arms, it looked like a castle. The entryway smelled like lemon polish and fresh linen. A staircase curved upward to the left. To the right, a living room with deep blue walls and a fireplace already lit, casting warm shadows across hardwood floors. Corvin had arrived ahead of them. The kitchen was stocked. The beds were made. Towels hung in the bathrooms, white and thick and impossibly soft. Celine stood in the center of the living room and didn't move. Mommy. Bryony's voice was small. Is this real? Yes, baby. Are we staying here? For now. Yes. Bryony walked to the front door. She examined the lock. A heavy deadbolt, solid and new. She turned it, heard the satisfying thunk of the mechanism engaging, and turned it again. Locked. Unlocked. Locked. Then she looked at her mother and smiled. It was not a big smile. It was barely a curve of the lips. But it was the first smile Celine had seen on her daughter's face in months, and it broke something open inside her. Can I lock it? Bryony asked. Every night? Can that be my job? Yes. Celine's voice cracked. That can be your job. Tansy woke as Celine carried her upstairs. She looked around the hallway with drowsy confusion, still clutching Button. Where are we? Somewhere safe. Is Daddy here? No, sweetheart. Daddy's not here. Tansy processed this for a moment. Then she said, Good. The word was so simple, so final. The judgment of a 5-year-old who had already learned to fear her own father. Celine laid her down in a bedroom with pale yellow walls and a window that looked out onto the backyard. The bed had a white comforter and pillows so soft Tansy sank into them like a stone into water. Mommy, Tansy murmured, already half asleep again. The bed is lying down. What do you mean, baby? We don't have to sleep sitting up. The bed is lying down. Celine's eyes filled with tears. For 9 nights before Vance had sent them to the Obsidian Club, she had been sleeping in a chair by the front door. Vance had started locking their bedroom at night, claiming he needed privacy, and Celine had been too afraid to sleep deeply anywhere in the house, so she had dozed upright in the living room, jerking awake at every sound, her body never fully resting. The girls had slept in their room, but they had known. Children always knew. Tansy had started asking why Mommy didn't lie down anymore, and now here was a bed. Lying down. Waiting. Celine tucked Tansy in, kissed her forehead, and walked to the doorway where Bryony was standing. "You too," Celine said. "Bed. I want to stay up with you." "You don't have to protect me tonight, sweetheart. The doors are locked. We're safe. You can rest." Bryony's eyes searched her mother's face, looking for the lie, looking for the crack in the assurance that would tell her safety was temporary. She didn't find it. "Okay," Bryony whispered. "Okay." She climbed into the second bed in Tansy's room, the room that would become their room, Celine realized, at least for now, and pulled the covers up to her chin. Celine sat on the edge of the bed and stroked her daughter's hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you had to be so brave." Bryony's eyes were closing. "You were brave too, Mommy. I don't feel brave. That's okay." Bryony's voice was fading into sleep. "You can feel brave tomorrow." Celine stayed there until both girls were breathing deeply, evenly, peacefully. Then she walked downstairs, sat on the couch in front of the fire, and cried. Not quiet tears. Not controlled tears. The kind of sobbing that comes from the very bottom of a person, from the place where all the unfelt grief accumulates until the pressure becomes unbearable. She cried for the years she had lost. For the woman she had been before Vance. For her daughters, who had learned to sleep with their shoes on, and lock doors and ask questions no child should ever have to ask. She cried until there was nothing left. And then, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she lay down on a couch in a house with locked doors and slept without dreaming. Cressida Halloran called at 7:15 the next morning. Her voice was direct, confident, and warm in the places where warmth mattered. A voice that had spent 30 years in courtrooms and had learned exactly when to be soft and when to be steel. "Celine," she said, "I've reviewed everything Stellan sent me. I want you to know that you did the right thing. Leaving, taking your daughters, getting out, that was the right thing. And we're going to make sure every court in this state understands that." Celine sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, watching the morning light move across the backyard. "He'll say I kidnapped them. He's done it before." "I know. Stellan briefed me." Cressida's voice remained steady. "That's a common tactic among abusers. They weaponize the system against their victims. They file false reports to force compliance. But here's the thing. I've seen this playbook 100 times, and I know exactly how to dismantle it." She outlined the plan. First, an emergency protective order, filed that morning, citing documented abuse and imminent threat. Second, a motion to establish Celine as the primary custodial parent pending a full hearing. Third, a comprehensive documentation effort. Hospital records, school reports, witness statements, anything that could build a paper trail of what Vance had done. "Do you have medical records?" Cressida asked. "Emergency room visits? Doctor's appointments? Anything where injuries were noted?" There was one time, 3 years ago. I told them I fell down the stairs." "That's in the record. We'll subpoena it. The pattern of injury will be inconsistent with a fall. I'll have a medical expert testify to that." "What about witnesses?" "I don't have anyone. He made sure of that." "You have your daughters. Bryony is 7, old enough for her statements to carry weight, especially given what she's clearly observed, and we have Mr. Varys's testimony about what happened at the Obsidian Club. 23 men heard your daughter ask if you would have to get on your knees. That's not nothing." Celine closed her eyes. I never wanted them to have to testify. I never wanted them to. I know. And I'll protect them as much as I can. But Celine, your daughters have already lived through this. Letting them speak about it, in a controlled environment with proper support, can be part of their healing. It's not additional trauma, it's acknowledgement. It's someone finally saying, "We believe you." The words landed somewhere deep in Celine's chest. "We believe you." 3 words she had never heard. 3 words she had stopped hoping to hear. The protective order was filed by noon. A judge reviewed the documentation, the emergency room visit, the pattern of controlling behavior Celine had outlined in a written statement, the account of what had happened at the Obsidian Club, and granted the order by 3 o'clock. Vance Duthie was served at his home at 4:15. He was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Celine or the girls. He was prohibited from contacting them by phone, email, or any other means. The house, his house, the house where Celine had lived in fear for 9 years, was no longer her concern. Cressida called with the news. "It's done. He's been served." He tried to argue with the officer, apparently made quite a scene, but the order stands. He cannot touch you. What about the kidnapping claim? Dismissed. The judge took one look at the documentation and saw exactly what it was. A tactic, not a legitimate concern. No charges will be filed. No investigation will be opened. Your daughters are legally in your custody. Celine's hand trembled so badly she almost dropped the phone. "There's more," Cressida continued. "I've been in contact with a detective who's been building a case against your husband for some time. Financial crimes, mostly, fraud, embezzlement, debt manipulation. But domestic violence charges may be added now that you're willing to testify. He's facing significant legal exposure." I don't want revenge. I just want to be free of him." "I understand. And you will be. But freedom sometimes requires making sure the person who hurt you can't hurt anyone else." Cressida paused. "You don't have to decide anything now. Just know that the option exists, and I'll support whatever you choose." When the call ended, Celine sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Bryony found her there an hour later, still staring at the cup of cold coffee. "Mommy, are you okay?" Celine looked at her daughter, at the face that had learned too young to be watchful, at the eyes that had seen too much. "Yes, baby, I'm okay." "You're crying." Celine touched her cheek. She hadn't realized. "These are good tears," she said. "These are happy tears." Bryony considered this. "I didn't know you could have happy tears." "You can. When something you've been carrying for a long time finally gets to be put down." She pulled Bryony close. "We're safe now. Really safe. A judge said so. The police know. Your father can't come near us." Bryony was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I still lock the door?" "Yes, sweetheart. You can always lock the door." "Even when we're not scared?" Celine kissed the top of her head. "Even then. Some things we do because they make us feel strong, not because we're afraid." Bryony nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. "I want to feel strong." 4 months later, on a February afternoon when the first hints of spring were beginning to soften the edges of winter, Celine and her daughters walked through the door of a small restaurant called Marigold's. It was a modest place, wooden tables, mismatched chairs, chalkboard menus. But it had become their place. Every Saturday, without fail, they came here for lunch. Bryony always ordered the grilled cheese with tomato soup. Tansy always ordered pancakes, even though it was afternoon, because Marigold served breakfast all day, and Tansy had declared this the most important rule in the whole world. Celine ordered whatever looked good, and she ate all of it. They had moved into an apartment 2 months ago, a small 2-bedroom on the west side of the city, with a window in the living room that looked out onto a courtyard with a magnolia tree. The rent was covered by an emergency assistance fund Cressida had connected her to. The furniture had come from a domestic violence organization that helped survivors rebuild. The walls were painted soft green, and Tansy had put stickers on every available surface: stars and moons and flowers, and a family of cartoon rabbits that marched in a line above her bed. Celine had gotten a job, part-time, at a library 3 blocks from the apartment. It didn't pay much, but it paid enough, and there was something healing about spending her days surrounded by books, by quiet, by the gentle rhythms of people seeking knowledge. Bryony had started 2nd grade at a school nearby. Her teacher had called Celine after the first month to say that Bryony was remarkably resilient and clearly very loved. Celine had cried in the bathroom afterward. Happy tears, the kind she was slowly learning to recognize. Tansy had started kindergarten. She had made 3 friends in the first week and come home with a painting of a house that had 4 windows, a purple door, and 3 stick figures standing in front of it. "That's us," she had explained, "and the purple door is because purple is the color of being safe." Celine had framed the painting. It hung in the kitchen. Now, in marigolds, Bryony dipped her grilled cheese into her soup and looked up at her mother. "Mom?" "Yes, baby?" "Do you remember that night? At the club?" Celine's chest tightened. They hadn't talked about it in months. She had been waiting for the girls to bring it up, letting them process at their own pace. "I remember. The man who helped us? Mr. Varys. Do you still talk to him?" Celine shook her head. "Not really. His lawyer checks in sometimes. He made sure we had what we needed. But he's not part of our life. He just helped us when we needed help." Bryony was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to write him a letter." "A letter?" "To say thank you. Because—" Bryony paused, searching for words. "Because he saw us, when everyone else just looked." Celine reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "That's a beautiful idea. We'll write it together." Outside the restaurant, across the street, a dark car idled at the curb. Inside, Stellan Varys watched through the window. He could see the woman and her daughters at a corner table. The older girl was dipping something into soup. The younger one was eating pancakes with the kind of focus that suggested nothing else in the world existed. The mother was smiling, a real smile, relaxed, unguarded, the kind of smile that comes from a body that has finally stopped bracing for impact. Corvin sat in the driver's seat saying nothing. He had learned long ago that Stellan's silences were not meant to be filled. After a long moment, Stellan spoke. "My mother used to take me to a place like that. A diner in Cardwell. We'd go on Saturdays when my father was working. She'd let me order whatever I wanted, and for 1 hour we'd pretend everything was normal." Corvin didn't respond. He simply waited. "I spent 49 years building walls," Stellan continued, "telling myself that power was protection, that if I was strong enough, nothing could touch me." He paused. "But I was wrong. The walls weren't protecting me. They were hiding me. From that kitchen, from that boy, from the promise I made to my mother and never kept." He watched as Celine laughed at something Tansy said, as Bryony smiled into her soup. "I kept it now," Stellan said quietly. 49 years late, but I kept it." He turned to Corvin. "Let's go." The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the gray afternoon light. Inside Marigold's, Tansy held up her fork with a piece of pancake on it. "Mommy, look. It's shaped like a heart." Celine looked. It wasn't shaped like a heart. It was shaped like a vague blob. But she smiled anyway. "You're right, baby. It is." "Hearts mean love," Tansy said solemnly. "And love means we're home." Celine pulled both her daughters close. "Yes," she whispered. "We're home." And 3 blocks away, in a small apartment with a magnolia tree outside the window, A purple door in a child's painting held steady. A deadbolt waited in its locked position. And a family of cartoon rabbits marched above a bed where a little girl would sleep that night without fear. Not anymore. Not ever again.